And so what humans actually want, or what they're motivated to want, and whether those wants are innate or manipulable is another question worth exploring, aren't as neatly expressible or as averageable or as context-free or whatever as economists like to believe. And it did strike me in that Don Draper era, they were sensibly asking those questions. And it led to some very, very interesting, actually very interesting brand creation. The Mustang, for example, the Ford Mustang, or Ronald McDonald.
Let me ask you this, Rory. Here on Leaders and Legends, we're always trying to figure out a way to look into history as a way to predict the future. So as we stand on the precipice of 2022, in your view, as one of the world's great ad men, a latter-day Don Draper, if you will, how do you assess the state of marketing going forward? And in my view, the critical role alchemy and instilling magic still plays, and maybe even more so to this day.
We consume stories and we act on the basis of meaning, not on the basis of absolute values. So one of the great lessons, which is being learned, by the way, by statisticians, is that the same data will tell you completely different things depending on how you cut it and the dimension at which you look at it. Okay, so we have to get very discomforted, I think, by the idea that data gives us objectivity, because data actually gives us more opportunities to be subjective in many respects. And so this idea that the perspective in which we see something, the way in which we frame it, the contrast we derive, determines the meaning determines the emotion, and the emotion determines the behavior, is vital, because it shows that there isn't a straightforward relationship between what you might call objective reality and human behavior. And there are cases, I think many cases, of brands that have been disproportionately successful, not because they're generally successful brands to survive. It helps if you have some unique, non-replicable, protectable talent. It may be one of scale, but in many cases, I think brands have become disproportionately successful because they've happened on a story. To be absolutely honest, they've surfed a particular narrative wave very successfully, or that in some cases, I always
give us an example, Rory. That's an interesting thread. Surf the narrative wave.
Well, in the case of Red Bull, I think it's interesting because it tastes horrible, costs a lot of money, and comes in a tiny can, all of which would traditionally be viewed as negatives for someone looking to produce a rational product. But in this case, I think if the story that accompanies it is that this has medicinal and psychoactive powers, and you look at the product as a placebo rather than as a conventional carbonated drink, you'll actually see that those three things, the negatives, become strengths. And this is why my book's called Alchemy. It's about turning a weakness into a strength. We're number two, so we try harder, is perhaps the greatest advertising case of saying we're not as big as Hertz, we don't have the economies of scale, we don't have the, possibly we don't have the range, we don't have the number of locations that our competitor does. But if you actually flip the perception of smaller size into one of ethos and customer service rather than one of standard company attributes, sort of gains to scale, that's a classic case of taking a story, a very countercultural story in a way. And if you look at the period in which it was told, in which people tended to assume big was better, and of course the same agency produced Think Small for Volkswagen, which was the ultimate countercultural car. It effectively said, okay, we're not going to compete with Cadillac because patently we can't. Okay, what we're going to do is we're going to tell a different story about what a car's for and how you should assess one. And so I find this interesting because it suggests that actually what something is one thing, and then how you react to that thing is not a product of what the thing is, it's a product of what the thing is and the general narrative you tell around it. I've been saying to KFC, by the way, for quite a few years, my relationship to KFC has never quite been the same. It's been considerably more positive ever since I discovered the fact that Colonel Sanders was 65 when he founded the company and came up with the whole idea of franchising. Now, suddenly you've got this story. It isn't a fast food outlet, which is just there to take your money. This man actually devoted pretty much his whole life to perfecting a particular recipe for fried chicken, inventing technologies like pressure frying. And it was only in his 60s. There's a wonderful thing you can watch on YouTube, which is an episode of What's My Line, where Colonel Sanders it's hysterically funny because you have these four people on the panel of What's My Line from some point in, I think, the early 1960s. Okay. And the man walks in, who is, of course, probably one of the 10 most, maybe 20 most recognizable humans in history. Okay. If you have a picture of Colonel Sanders, okay, there's no really mistaking him for anybody else, is there? Okay. So, in terms of real, okay, Mao and, there'd be various other people who'd come very, very high on the kind of recognition stakes. And, I guess Che Guevara did a good job and so on, but Colonel Sanders would be kind of up there with Stalin, okay, right? And yet there are these four people in the 1960s trying to guess who the hell he is. Okay. Now, what I mean about that is just that, the meaning of something is not actually a function of what it is. The meaning of something, we are evolutionarily predisposed to notice and respond to certain stimuli and messages more than we are others. We have storytelling deep, I think, embedded in our DNA. And to attempt to solve political problems without the effort at looking at how you might recontextualize first the definition of the problem, okay, which is the most important part, by the way. That's the most important role of creativity. And then the presentation of the solution to that problem seems to me to be not playing with a full deck. Now, I don't know what's happening with your election in Canada at the moment. Trudeau just fell off a cliff, didn't he, or something?
Well, we're going to stay away.
Okay, no, I'll stay
away
away
from all things political here. But you brought up. Here's one of the
I'll give you a lovely
that...
example because I'm gonna big up a fellow Canadian. You've got in Canada. By the way, I think Canadian and Australian intellectual life are extraordinarily interesting. By the way. Now, Canadian intellectual life would historically have deferred to the British, and Canadian might have deferred to the American. But I think that business of being just slightly at one remove, it's a bit like, it's a bit like Australian fauna, it's evolved in isolation and it's produced life forms which you don't find anywhere else. And I think the same thing happens with ideas to some extent. But I mean, Roger L. Martin, who you'll know, the former dean of Rotman School, who I didn't know of his existence a year ago, and I've just discovered this guy.
Yeah, Roger Martin, the opposable mind. It's not either mind. Or, it's an and. But Rory, you said something in the 10 Rules of Alchemy. It's in the book, and you mentioned Red Bull. And I think our viewers and our listeners would love to hear a deeper dive. You said, and I quote, "It doesn't pay to be logical when everybody else is being logical." And when I look at Red Bull, for example, and you alluded to it, there's nothing logical about a smaller can. The taste is highly questionable, to be, overly polite Canadian about this, right? And charge a premium. And yet Red Bull has emerged as this brand, as you know, Rory, that in many respects is showing the way for a new mindset with respect to marketing, in that they're a media company first, creating their own media with a very aggressive YouTube strategy and doing things like, the free fall from space that they did a few years ago. Love to hear your thoughts on the future of marketing and branding, with taking a page maybe from the Red Bull recipe about being a media company first that just happens to sell an energy drink.
Well, I think one of the most interesting things about Red Bull, and they run a Formula One team on, for the lols. I mean, okay, it's helped by the fact that it's a high margin product and they're immensely profitable, but undoubtedly that means that people are prepared, indeed, I would argue, want to pay a premium for the particular benefit that the product promises. And I mean, it's known in the placebo effect that generally drugs, analgesics notably, work better if you tell people they're expensive. And it's also appropriate because it's a form of costly signaling in that they don't just say things, they do them. And advertising, it's worth remembering, mass advertising is a costly signal. It's an expensive thing to do. But they go one stage further and actually create the very, they don't, in other words, rent space at the circus, they create the circus. And I think, I mean, okay, it's something you can only do when you've achieved that kind of scale. It's worth saying. I wouldn't necessarily recommend that of many brands, but they're a brand, I think, with a license to do that. And that's an interesting thing, which is all about showing off, which is a large amount of display as you do what you can get away with. And, that's true in, large parts of human behavior. You signal your status by getting away with things that other people can't. That's probably an innate thing. So a beautiful example of that is the fact that in nature, poisonous snakes are brightly colored. Ladybirds, you would think, wouldn't you, as a ladybird, given that you live on leaves, it'd be quite sensible to be a kind of green color so that predators wouldn't eat you. It's called aposematic signaling, and it's what you do to signal that you can only do this because you're possessed of a particular quality. It's very interesting. So poisonous snakes are often very brightly colored. Poisonous frogs are often almost luminous, okay? And you have this thing, the ladybird. Now, it sits on a leaf, but it's red and black. And birds have evolved the instinct, which is, if this thing isn't even bloody well trying to hide, maybe it's not very edible and I shouldn't take the risk. Okay, stick insect trying to hide, probably quite tasty. Brightly colored thing, give it a wide berth. That may be why the lionfish, when it escaped into the Caribbean, did so well, because it's very brightly colored Asian fish, and effectively the Caribbean fish which would normally eat it would go, I'm not looking at that thing. It's not even trying to blend in, right? But the ladybird, if you eat a ladybird, apparently its knees secrete a particularly foul-tasting chemical. So most birds don't do it more than once. But of course, it's no good for the individual ladybird for the bird to learn that experience at its own expense. So what you do is you deliberately don't try to hide. And so it's a form of signaling. And so I think, the understanding of this thing of what we signal when we do particular things, when we use mass media, our message, I think, carries greater weight, simply because I'm not just saying this to you, because if I'm just talking to you, I could be exploiting your own area of ignorance. I'm saying this to everybody, because if there's anybody there who's going to contradict me, you're all going to hear about it. When we get married, we make our vows in church in front of a mass audience of everybody we know simultaneously. We don't go door to door making our vows. And I think once you understand that, you understand that this business of pursuing media selection on the basis of efficiency is probably a necessary part of marketing. I don't dispute it, by the way. It's a very necessary part of sales. I would also argue it's really important to optimize the last mile of whatever you do, because if you haven't optimized your last mile and you haven't optimized conversion, then all the work you do upstream isn't going to work. If Red Bull hadn't got utterly fantastic distribution, which it partly achieves by having very large margins, which means that it's highly lucrative and being small in terms of margin profit per shelf inch, Red Bull's a pretty damn good product to stock, whether you're a gas station or a hypermarket. Okay, you'd be pretty silly not to want to cut at that action. But once they've got that distribution fairly much guaranteed, and they've got their pricing and margin right, then actually, given that they've got the last mile right, then it pays you to do things which are, wasteful. So, I'm not one of these people who goes, oh, digital marketing, it's all stupid, it's just transactional. No, you've got to get that right. And maybe it's the first thing you should try and get right. What I'm saying is that if you stop there and you use digital media purely as a transactional efficiency optimization tool, you've got the wrong mindset. In particular, because I would argue that the greater value of digital is in exploration, not in exploitation. I think they're making a mistake there, because if you put someone in charge of digital and he's only bonused on the value of his transactions, the greater potential value of that guy, which would be discovering really weird things, is actually destroyed, because he's been turned into a kind of optimization engine, an efficiency optimization engine, when really the guy in charge of digital advertising should really be head of discovery as much as head of, what would you call it, head of conversion.
And again, Rory, that sparks an interesting question that goes to rule 6 of the 10 rules of alchemy.
I think there are 11.
Logic. What's that?
I think there are 11. I think it's called the 10 rules of alchemy, and it goes up to number 11.
Of course it does.
Pure whimsy and a brief homage to a Spinal Tap.
Yeah. But you said in number 6, the problem with logic, it kills off magic.
Yeah.
And so if I look at Ogilvy, and he's an icon from the industry. You're the vice chairman of the firm that still bears his name. As I understand it, and I'd love to hear you expand on this, everything starts with the message before the medium.
If you think about it, first of all, okay, if the solution to a problem were logical, if the problem were easily defined,
right,
okay, and it was solvable at the scale and dimension at which you've defined it, it already would have been solved by now. So our appetite for the counterintuitive has to get greater the more, in a sense, when I say this, secondly, the logical space is always overcrowded. You may not go bankrupt following logic, but you won't discover anything really significantly valuable, as Red Bull did, that there was a market for a weird tasting drink, or to some extent Uber did, which is my argument was, it doesn't matter how quickly the cab turns up. What matters is diminishing human uncertainty. Okay. And I would give the Uber map, an award for magic, in the sense that don't get me wrong, I don't want the reason I don't like waiting for a cab isn't that I care whether it arrives in 5 minutes or whether it arrives in 9. It's two things. One, I'm terrified it's not going to arrive at all, or that it's going to arrive 45 minutes late. Okay. That's the first thing that creates anxiety. The second thing is I'm now on tenterhooks because I don't know when the cab's got to turn up. And instead of sitting back and having a pint with some friends, I've got to stare out of the window or stand in the rain. Okay. Now, Uber solves the problem not by making cabs turn up faster, which would have been to some extent a met unneed, the opposite of an unmet need. Instead, the Uber solves the problem by removing the uncertainty. I've said the same thing to airlines. The first thing to concentrate on, bizarrely, within reason, is not the punctuality of your aircraft. Now, I'm being a bit cheeky here because there are lots of other reasons why airlines want their aircraft to be punctual, which is to do with the whole business of, optimization of the fleet. But from a consumer standpoint, good airport information is more important to the experience than the precise level of punctuality of the aircraft taking off. So what I mean is there's a huge difference in an airline departure board between delayed and delayed 47 minutes. To be honest, most of us who are business travelers have built a few hours buffer into our schedule. We're not basing our arrival at the conference on the fact that the plane will arrive perfectly on time and that the taxi ride to the airport will go exactly to plan, because we're intelligent enough to know that in any leg of a journey, shit happens. We didn't set off for the airport at the last minute for the same reason. Okay. Now, once you understand that, you realize that delayed basically says be miserable, whereas delayed 47 minutes in an airport with Wi-Fi and reasonable facilities isn't actually that much of an inconvenience anymore. In fact, you can text people and say, my flight's delayed 47 minutes, so can you just, make the taxi turn up a bit later, or, whatever. Whereas delayed is bad news, but without a backstop, without a flaw. And that as human beings, that drives us nuts, because we go, actually, I bet this is just they're breaking it to us gently. It's just a precursor to cancelled. We start panicking. Uber, look, you basically, instead of, oh my God, where's my taxi? They said it'd be here at 2:30. It's, oh, look, he's stuck at those traffic lights, typically Admiralty Arch, if you live in London, where the sequence of the traffic lights is about as stupid as you could possibly imagine, and where they go green for about 1.7 seconds. Okay, he's stuck at those traffic lights. I'll have another cup of tea. He'll be with me in 6, or 10. Okay, and the point I'm making is that the objective qualities of something, or rather more commonly, the objective quantities of something. And here I'll cite your countryman, Roger Martin, when he says, we've developed the skill and we've celebrated the quantification of quantities, the measurement and manipulation of quantities over and above the appreciation of qualities. And the spreadsheet, the education system, lots and lots of things in technology and the way we actually design human life have driven us to spend too much effort in the manipulation of quantities and presentation of quantities, the McKinseyite approach, and far too little effort in the Don Draper approach of the appreciation of what quality is.
And that begs a follow-up question around number 8. And again, I can't recommend this book enough. I see this, Rory, don't mean to flatter you, but this is, to me, so critical considering the crossroads we're at from 20th century marketing into 21st century, and how some of the enduring art of creating magic will never disappear, no matter how much the technology changes. But in number 8, you say test counterintuitive things because nobody else will. And there's a story here from Canada that I shared briefly with you about a 2006 approach where my friend Jim Gilbert completely went counterintuitive when he became Canada's huggable car dealer. The products were still the same. The pricing was still the same. But I'd love to hear your thoughts across the pond, as it were, on how that brand that's been created, and it's become a juggernaut in its category, how that validates point number 8 of testing counterintuitive things.
There are a lot of things going on there with the word huggable, by the way, which are clever, because it implies trust, and trust is something you can actually only imply, you can't actually claim. Okay. It implies long-term customer satisfaction. Okay. But it also implies price obliquely, doesn't it? So it's a very but the final thing is, because it's so different to every other car dealer, you also achieve, and we're getting into kind of bar and sharp territory here, you also achieve differentiation. Because if I'm right, he kind of filled up the dealerships with plushy toys and so forth.
Yeah, it's like Disney, hundreds of teddy bears and mascots and merry-go-rounds as the story became the launching pad for a one-of-a-kind brand.
And his expansion is really interesting. His success is fantastic. But it achieves lots of things precisely by going in absolutely, the opposite direction to everybody else. And, it's also such a bold claim that it's one that he's required to live up to. So Roger Martin's whole point of a brand is the extent to which it repeatedly delivers the promise it makes. So every company is in, if you like, in a kind of interesting state between promise and delivery. And generally, there are obviously aspects to companies which entirely independent of marketing, to do with supply chains, access to capital, all those things, which enable them to deliver something that someone else can't. But the extent to which the consumer believes in that promise, whatever it is that differentiates your business, the extent to which they actually believe that it will continue to be delivered, and dependably so, is really where brand value sits in the equation to a great extent.
And in the spirit of testing counterintuitive things, you were saying just before we went on, that requires an enormous amount of courage. Can you
Well, one of the things
expand
must
on that a
be,
little bit?
how did it affect his relations with other car dealers? Because my hunch is that other car dealers would slightly have taken the piss out of him for doing this. Is that fair?
Well, I can tell you very early on, many at the auto auctions, Rory, where he would pick up his inventory, laughed openly in his face. The rest of the category basically thought this is the dumbest thing anyone could come up with. In other words, no one was applauding his marketing genius.
No. Well, one of the vital things.
No one at all, because the entire industry is all about, you know, 0.9% financing, better quality, better selection, better service, better value.
So one thing, but he's talking about the emotional benefit of these things rather than their features. That's exactly the first point.
That's it.
Which is that you want to hug him. You actually feel a sense of gratitude and affection towards this guy. But the second thing is, one of the great obstacles, I think, to great branding is, this is why entrepreneurs are so crucial in the process, is that peer group approval is often the worst enemy of originality. That we want to be approved of by our peer group of fellow car dealers. There was a great advertising campaign in the UK, by the way, for the AA, which is like AAA in the United States. Okay, well, there's presumably Canadian. Is it CAA? Is it?
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, you got it. Yeah. You got it in Canada. Okay. And the one downside of this, by the way, is when they call themselves the fourth emergency service, i.e. fire, police, ambulance, and then there's the Automobile Association. Okay. One slight downside was the people driving AA vans used to get abuse from the police. Okay, because the police thought it was highly presumptuous of these AA drivers to claim they were an emergency service. And so ambulance drivers used to flick the finger at AA vans. But from the customer's point of view, it's exactly what you want to hear. And so I think there's something there, which is that our fear of looking ridiculous. There's a wonderful story, I think it goes back to Claude Hopkins, where he made this great virtue of the beer is so pure that we wash our bottles twice, you see. And the brewer said, but all breweries wash their bottles twice. You know, if I run advertising that says we wash our bottles twice to preserve the purity of our beer, all my competitors will laugh at me. He goes, yeah, that's because your competitors know. The customer doesn't know everybody washes their bottles twice, and we will own this property. And it all just arose from a factory visit where, of course, Claude Hopkins, I think it was, didn't know that this was standard practice. And so there's a really interesting debate there, which is quite often doing something counterintuitive or weird will earn you the opprobrium or ridicule of your peer group in the industry, which is why sometimes I think innovation comes from a funny place geographically. You know, I mean, if you notice, IBM created the PC division in Boca Raton, not in Armonk, because they wanted it to be a whole coastline away from head office. You know, Nespresso was created at a distance from Nestle. But also you require this entrepreneurial mentality where the guy either doesn't know what he's supposed to know. Sometimes ignorance is a fantastic spur to invention, by the way, simply because you don't know the category conventions. Or a certain shamelessness. In other words, you don't really care what these other people think because you don't operate in that world.
Mm. You said at one time, most economic problems are marketing problems in disguise.
Yeah.
What, in your view, when you look at your body of work with Alchemy, what are you most proud of from that particular project?
Now, just to be clear, when I say marketing in that sense, I don't mean Marcon's problems in disguise. Okay, I mean marketing in the wider sense of the multiple P's. Are there 5, 6? I can never remember. People keep adding P's, but I mean marketing in the wider sense, which is the deeper understanding of human need, of unmet human needs, and the delivery of the product in such a format and place, okay, and accompanied by such a message that it's easy for the consumer to adopt a new behavior in response to it. And so an example of this I talk about where the real problem is now no longer technological, it's psychological, would be solar panels. Because the way solar panels, I mean, the extraordinary genius has gone into making them lighter, thinner, less expensive, more efficient, everything about it. I mean, it's worth having solar panels, arguably in Canada. When I was a kid, you might just about debate them if you lived in Arizona or the Sahara Desert, but the idea of solar energy in Canada was laughable, okay? And now it isn't. It's conceivable. It's not unreasonable. Okay. Now, what's interesting, though, is that no one's worked out how to sell them, because I assume I have to write a check for $30,000 and have an enormous acreage of these panels irremovably installed on the roof of my house, a house which 50% of us are probably planning to sell in the next 5 or 6 years. Okay. Now, I know psychologically that consumers hate making those kind of purchases, one-off, high price. I mean, the car industry, and I'd love to talk to your mate Jim about this, if the car industry could do a lease to buy scheme, it would sell far more cars, okay? So you had a period of exploration where the car was returnable. Now, obviously, it's slightly difficult in the car industry. It's not impossible, but the point I'm making is that writing a check for $30,000 for something which 1% of the time may turn out to be a total disaster, that's something humans instinctively hate doing. Now, if you could install one panel in the garden and it powered your conservatory, then you installed 2 more for another $2,000, and now it started to charge your Tesla, okay? And then you installed 4 more and you started getting a rebate from the electricity company or whatever, okay? If you could actually do this in a modular fashion, we'd be quite interested, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, but what they've done is they've said solar energy, brilliant thing. Have you got $30,000 to basically place on this risk? Now, I know that mathematically I'm going to be better off statistically on average, but I'm still worried about that 1 to 2% risk of bloody disaster that I don't act. And that's what, we don't generally do things that bring with it a 2% chance of total catastrophe. We've evolved not unreasonably to say you've only got to do 50 of those things in your lifetime and you'll probably end up dead, right?
It's fascinating.
So that's a case, that's a classic case where we're still looking at it as if it's a technological problem, when really no one's worked out it's not that no one's worked out how to make them, it's that no one's worked out how to sell them. And there's as much innovation required in the marketing side of the equation, in the demand side of the equation, as there is in the supply side of the equation at this stage in the product's technical development, I would argue.
And that's where I think alchemy plays such a critical role for all business leaders, all marketers going forward, to understand it's much more than just making the thing and then doing a laundry list of features, advantages, benefits. So Rory, when you look into your crystal ball for what's ahead for the wider scope of marketing and brand building, over the next, 2022 and the decade, what do you see?
It's really easy. We need to first of all, we need to become more comfortable with creativity, because you can't come up with something significantly new without an act of the imagination. The idea that you can extrapolate from past data without any leap of hypothesis or hunch. Abductive inference is what your compatriot Roger would call it, okay? You can't do that. So you have to become more comfortable with creativity. You then have to test more, because this isn't an exact science. Lots of things replicate in one place, but don't replicate in another, because humans are highly context sensitive in the way they perceive things. Okay, but, and here's the thing, so behavioral science provides you with a license to test things that don't make sense to an economist, okay, in a world of homo economicus. Now, I think the pandemic has shown us that, first of all, we need to experiment more anyway, because it's ridiculous that it took a pandemic to get us to adopt video conferencing to the extent we have. We should have been experimenting with these things anyway and asking questions. Can I reinvent my business around Zoom? Yes, I think you can. I was talking to people in financial services. I said that actually the Zoom call is exactly what I want from a financial advisor. I don't want the guy turning up at my house, but I don't want a guy I only speak to on the phone. This is exactly right for certain forms of transaction. It also means your catchment area is potentially global rather than being local. So it's hugely important. And I don't think anybody's talking about this nearly enough. I think Zoom is, 50% as important as the internet was in 1996. Okay. But also we need to experiment more because the world's changed, and the ratio between exploit and explore. This is exploit, explore trade-offs come up first in the science of animal foraging, because there's always a trade-off between animals simply eating what they know. And explore often appears to the rational mindset as an inefficiency when it isn't. Okay, it's actually yin and yang. The explore and the exploit are actually codependent. You've got to exploit what you discover, but if you don't explore, you never discover anything in the first place, and you become trapped in a local maximum. Now, when the world changes more, you need to explore more. And when they know that from animal foraging, it's also a case from AI, by the way. You shift the exploit-explore trade-off depending on the stability of the environment in which it's trying to, from which it's trying to profit. And so in these years, some brands will be minimally affected, let's be honest, okay? But there are categories, business travel would strike me as one, where looking at your data on business traveler behavior from 1998 or 2017 is more likely to distract you than it is to inform you, to be honest.
In the few minutes we have left as we wrap this up, Rory, the 10th rule of alchemy, let's spinal tap this thing right now. You said, dare to be trivial.
Yep.
Why does trivia
because
endless fascination for you, and why do you believe others should also pay attention to the trivial?
First of all, because a lot of problems can't be solved at the scale at which they're defined, because the data you have access to at one scale is highly aggregated and may not contain the part of the process which is decisive. And so in terms of determining context, small contextual changes, if you think about it, my knowing that Colonel Sanders was 65 when he founded KFC is seemingly a total irrelevance, okay? And yet it changes the way I feel about the whole organization. And the point I'm making there is that in storytelling, we started our conversation with that, the difference between saying I'm late and the difference between saying I'm delayed or I've been detained, okay? That they mean the same thing to the speaker, but to the listener, it's actually decisive. Okay, now I think unless we're happy to operate at varying scales of seeming importance, will fail to solve most problems. And of course, most people want problems to be solved at the top because that's where you earn the credit and that's where the big bucks are. And it's suitable to your status to solve problems from a senior level with senior level interventions. But the way to solve the real problem might be going down to call center scripts, for example. Mm-hmm. Beneath your level of dignity, but nonetheless, that's the scale at which the problem needs to be solved. Not at the scale of kind of, mass generalization about aggregate consumer behavior, which is all you have access to when you're at the top.
Rory, we could literally talk for hours on these subjects. Alchemy, if you were to, in a nutshell, now that some time has passed, can you describe what the enduring legacy of your work from this particular publication you hope it will be?
Okay, one thing I can lay claim to in part was I encouraged the UK government via the Behavioural Insights team to take light touch regulation on vaping and electronic cigarettes, because my alchemist perspective was, who cares if they're cheating themselves, okay? If you can basically make people feel they're smoking and they aren't ingesting the carcinogens, what's the problem, okay? So I fought against the purists who said the only, and mine was a harm reduction perspective, effectively. So I can lay claim to that as something I'm proud of. But more widely, the argument is that don't leap because the assumption of economics, which is the high status mental model to hold in business and policy making discussions, is a prisoner of its own viewpoint. And the viewpoint is you always have to leap to objective rationality to solve the problem, whereas the solution might be found psychologically or in a strange mixture of the two. One of the most interesting ideas in Canada, which I think your previous a few politicians were interested in, was Roger's idea of having effectively a tax break on the first $200,000 of lifetime earnings, so that actually, instead of saying the first X thousand dollars you earn in a year is tax-free, instead it's the first X $100,000 of income you earn in your lifetime is tax-free. Now that's an example of taking something and solving a problem by looking at it with one assumption removed, which is that tax has to be an annual process, where what happens in 2018 bears no relation to what happened in 2017. Now, once you look at it through that lens, the consumer lens, and the lens of life as it's actually lived, rather than through the economic lens, you suddenly see something which nobody else sees.
And I think that's one of the most. And isn't that right there, Rory? Isn't that the secret? Yeah. See the things and do the things that
nobody else sees. Yeah, right. And ask the questions that nobody else asks. And the problem is that in institutions, you are penalized for doing so because you look weird. And I'm going to add one more to it, which didn't occur to me until I had a conversation 4 days ago. You're doubly penalized for doing that if you're female, I think. Oof. And a woman said to me, we in Ogilvy, we sort of got rid of two people who were awkward but brilliant. And I just happened to say in passing, and interestingly, both of them were kind of female. I wonder if there's anything significant. And my chief executive, fantastic woman, said, no, that's absolutely true. She said, because as a man, you can be eccentric, but as a woman, eccentricity gets you branded as mad.
The double standard.
So it's a very interesting question, and I listened to that, and I thought Fiona Gordon, which could be a Canadian name, but she's Scottish. But she said that, and I said, never occurred to me before. But you're absolutely right. It's very. If you look at fashion, okay, it's much higher risk for a woman to dress eccentrically than for a man. Okay, you know, the interesting thing is that it's generally a process which exposes you to the risk of blame. And in an institutional setting where actually most of our activity is motivated by the removing the risk of blame. And that leads to a conventional approach to problem solving, where you're just, the logical default is to act as though everybody were an economic homo economicus, kind of weird, rational, optimizing creature, and then to proceed from that assumption. And it's a terrible assumption.
I just think, Rory, like the book Alchemy, just a conversation with you opens a Pandora's box to deeper understanding, to help people ask better questions and do things in a way that helps them discover their true identity and their real reason for being. Can't thank you enough, my friend, for joining us here on Leaders and Legends.
It's always a joy. Thank you so much.
Rory Sutherland, Vice Chairman of Ogilvy from London in the United Kingdom. Rory's book, Alchemy, available at fine online retailers everywhere. And we so appreciate Rory for stopping by and chatting with us. Here on Leaders and Legends, we thank you for watching, where you never know who you're going to meet or what you'll discover.